All right. So Awkward is back with the awkward interviews. Really excited about my guest today. He's actually a former computer scientist. His name is Greg Doucette, but he's much more well known as a trial attorney and as a Twitter personality. He works in North Carolina, where he runs what he calls a small practice focused on protecting young people from the government, helping aspiring entrepreneurs, and defending the First Amendment. Greg became Twitter famous in 2016 while defending a 17-year-old Black high school student who was wrongly accused of a crime. Greg's tweets went viral, and the story was covered in Forbes, Fusion, Vibe, Gossip, and more. In 2019, Greg leveraged his following, now at about 130,000, to expose a $2.6 million sweetheart deal the University of North Carolina Board of Governors struck with the North Carolina Sons of Confederate Veterans, a male-only charity for the ancestors of Confederate military, who are known, among other things, for a coordinated public display of more and more and larger Confederate flags. Greg's whistleblowing got this corrupt bargain thrown out, which I love. In 2020, Greg continued to use his Twitter account for good, creating a massive thread on instances of police brutality. This is actually how I was first introduced to him. Exposing this as one of my full-time jobs. So this massive thread ended up being reported on by The Verge, Insider, Vice, NBC News, Time, Mike, Slate, and others. And Greg used some of my tweets, which is what clued me into what he was doing. In his spare time, Greg runs the T. Greg Doucette Foundation, focused on raising money for local charities in Durham. And while he isn't a Trump supporter, if he were, I probably couldn't handle having him on. Greg does consider himself a conservative.
Yes.
So while I've certainly featured some folks on here who fall right of me on the political spectrum, and that's obvious, that's pretty easy to do. I'm as left as they get. So this actually marks the first time I'm featuring someone who considers themselves to be to the right of center. So Greg, welcome to the show. You seem like a really cool dude.
We'll see if you still think that after the show.
Exactly. So first, what makes you a conservative? I gotta know.
So that's a complicated question. I don't know if you've heard of Irving Kristol. So he is the father of Bill Kristol, was a big time, conservative pundit. And he's referred to as the father of neoconservatism. That part doesn't matter. What matters is that one thing he said often was that you had in America two types of conservatives. You had ones who were anti-state, anti-government, and then ones who were only anti-left. They only care about what the Democrats are for so they can be against it. The modern Republican Party is pretty much all anti-left folks. I have always been the anti-state side. So in a more normal time, I'd be probably classified as a libertarian.
Yeah.
But if you've seen libertarians online, a lot of them are absolutely crazy. I'm sure there's some good ones, and don't get me wrong, not all libertarians, throw a hashtag on that. But they had a guy who was their vice chairman not too long ago who had some Facebook posts where it's like, racism is bad, but it's acceptable. The worst part is government spending. You can have one in the Libertarian Party, you can't have the other. And that got worse under Trump. So politically, I have no home. I can't be a capital L libertarian. I can't be a Republican. But growing up, a lot of the things I read about to try and, learn politics, political philosophy, I still am fairly conservative. I don't have a party. So the way I explain it to folks is that if you were to take, 5 baskets, and on one side you have things the government must do, it's required, it's the whole reason we have a government. Then you have things government should do, On the other side, things government must not do, should not do. And in the middle, there's a bunch of stuff that just whatever, it can do it, whether it should or not is up to the people. I'll have more stuff in the must do, a lot more stuff on the must not, should not do. And then the should and coulds are kind of different compared to the folks who tend to be more progressive.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, and interestingly, like I've learned more and more about libertarianism over the last couple of years too, because my perception of them, or of that ideology, was that it always was somewhere on the right also, like, and I'm learning from others that you can be an anarcho libertarian, like you can be a far left libertarian.
Right.
Which actually intellectually that does make sense. I just never thought of it before. Because it's like, to be an anarchist, you would be about less big government, right? So, so when you talk about these buckets, what in your mind must the government do?
So I would use as an example, providing for defense. From the smallest villages to the biggest countries, having a government, you basically take over the role of defending its people, is part of it. So, a lot of progressive folks tend to be hostile towards the military. I'm not. I think the military is part of, what the government is supposed to do. Now, whether we go into any given country to do any sort of thing, that's up to the people and their representatives, and whether it's a good idea or not is up for debate. But I still think you got to have a military around. That sort of protection matters. I'm a bit weird when it comes to the border. I'm pro-immigration, but I also think the border should be as airtight as possible, because you want to know who's coming in. Now, you should let pretty much anybody in my mind, but you at least got to know to make sure that you're not having, random crazy people coming across. So that sort of thing, protecting the people. I'd put in kind of the should part, this whole notion of promoting the general welfare, something in the Constitution. What constitutes a safety net? Some form of thing should exist. So you'll have Republicans, libertarians that refuse to get to that point. I think that's a tool of government. That's why we created the government, to help make sure that you don't have anyone so far down compared to everybody else that they're just totally destitute and have no way of getting, back up.
Right.
So I would put those as the two big things. Include on the must do. I like public education, as bizarre as that sounds. I like all education, so private schools are fine too. But I'm a product of K through 12 public schools. I went to a public university. I went to a public law school, and I look at myself compared to my parents and my grandparents. I have a lot more opportunities now because of the education that I got, and that was paid for by taxpayers. I threw in some tuition money to help cover part of that through student loans that I'll be repaying until I die. But the fact is that was a tax funded thing.
Right.
So, usually I tell folks, if you look at the Constitution, and maybe calling me a constitutionalist might be a better descriptor of my politics, I guess. But you look at the powers of Congress in Article 1, a lot of that stuff is stuff that the government either must or should do, in my mind. I like having the government handling the currency. I know a lot of people are into crypto. I'm not. I feel kind of weird about, if you flip a switch or take down an internet router, all my money goes away. Maybe that will change over time as I learn more, but just, I'm 40 and I've been in a world without crypto for 35 years. It feels kind of weird to me now, but having post offices, that sort of thing, making sure that mail can be delivered to people, having a, copyright, trademark, patent system, that sort of thing.
All right. So I'm ready to start a campaign to get you to rewrite your bio as constitutionalist.
Look, I can do that easily. The problem is that no one knows what the hell that means, because it's just not something that's used in the public parlance.
Yes, you're right. But I don't know if they know what conservative means.
Well, that's true.
And, they don't know what it means to you. So they make assumptions. And so the most, what has excited me so much about doing this one with you today is because, like, you're on my side. I'm on your side because of, like, I know that because of what you spend your time doing on Twitter and what you spend your time doing as a lawyer and what you spend your time doing with the foundation. And yet you call yourself a conservative. So I have to that's one of the things that was so interesting to me, is like understanding what that means to you. And then the next part leads me to my next question. If you are I guess, given that that's the label you have applied to yourself thus far, there must be other, and certainly some of your politics are conservative. So to those who you've mentioned who are conservative and don't agree with the politics you have that include social services, what has the feedback been that you've received from these people regarding, like, for instance, your police brutality thread?
Oh, they hate it. They call me a Republican in name only, and I go, "Oh, I'm not a Republican." And they say, "Well, you're not a conservative either." So let me back up a little bit. I agree with you. No one knows what conservative means these days in terms of its application to politics. But if you look at a lot of the intellectual basis for it, you can go back to Burke, you can go through, Hazlitt, a whole bunch of other writers in between. The ideological things that can be described as conservative are still the same. They don't change just because the party has lost its fucking mind. Pardon my language. If you need to bleep that, go for it. But I've not changed my philosophy just because the world has changed around me. I still think certain things are there. Being anti-police brutality, to my mind, is eminently conservative, because if you view conservative politics, to me, being conservative or liberal really only matters with respect to your orientation towards government. Do you want more government or less government? Do you want government to do more things or less things? The police are the armed enforcement wing of the government. You can't separate the two. All police officers are government employees designed to enforce the government's laws, and they don't care whether or not you're violating them justly or not, or even if you're not violating them at all. It's just what government does. And so the same problems that affect police affect other government bureaucracies. The difference is that the cops have guns and can kill you and can get away with it and get given qualified immunity after the fact. So from my standpoint, the stuff I've been doing on Twitter, a lot of people paid attention to it last year, but I've been doing it for, over a decade now.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It's something that fits easily within my political, views. But to someone who looks at themselves as a Republican first, they don't think about whether or not they're a conservative or not. They think about they're a Republican, they're part of a tribe, they hate the Democrats, whatever. They're in a group that loves police.
Yeah.
And so anything negative towards police really offends them. And the secret is that both parties love police.
Yeah.
I say on Twitter often, love of police brutality is strongly bipartisan. You look at votes on bills, you look at approval of union contracts, you look at excuses made when cops kill people. The fact is Republicans like cops because they keep minorities in their place, and Democrats like cops because they keep poor people out of sight. Let's go arrest some homeless folks. Let's do a sweep, that sort of thing. So it's there is no home politically for someone like me, but how you choose to describe the politics, you can make an argument on both sides. As far as, I think it's conservative because I'm opposed to these government agents violating the Constitution for sport with my money. But at the same time, if you're a progressive and you're focused on making sure that communities aren't over policed and you don't have homeless folks being thrown in jail for being homeless, I understand that argument too. It's just, trying to explain all that in 280 characters on Twitter, that doesn't go over well most of the time.
Yeah. And I certainly, I get attacked by all sides also. And I loved your response. And that's really, the conservative viewpoint on it is so obvious, actually, that it does say a lot about, it says a lot about some, what most of us already knew, that it's not really about, it's more about this tribe, right? The Republican tribe. And I think, the Blue Lives Matter stuff, that was the hypocrisy and the absurdity of all of that was really on display on January 6th.
Yep.
right? When a ton of them, I mean, it's just, there's more to it, but like a ton of them actually joined. So the integration of white supremacists and policing in modern day was on clear display because they were actually the protesters themselves. But then the way that they treated their heroes who were doing their jobs on that day made it clear that they're only for Blue Lives Matter when it's attacking Black Lives Matter protesters, right, or Black
Exactly.
people or anti-fascists. So I got a ton of other questions for you, but the conversation has gone this way, so I have to ask you now. You mentioned the progressives and I forget the words you used exactly, but like making sure that communities aren't over policed. A lot of us obviously want to do much more than that. So, and there's also a lot of misunderstandings about what defunding and abolition actually mean. There are people who believe that defunding um, is the thing unto itself. You just take money from cops and that's it. So now we just have police with less money to do their jobs and nothing else changes. And then when it comes to abolition, there's the common misconception that, it happens tomorrow. We have no police, we have no prisons when we wake up. And also that it would mean complete anarchy. There would be, again, nothing put in its place. Obviously, abolition would be considered a more radical next step beyond simply defunding. Really, what defunding means is taking the money from police budgets and putting them in alternative.
Something useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is your take on defunding and then abolition?
So I'm gonna switch them. I'm gonna cover abolition first.
Okay.
And the reason why is that I'm not an abolitionist yet. That might change over time, but I have a hard time mentally getting there. I've read a lot of abolition oriented stuff. I've also seen a lot of your videos just because it overlaps with what I already cover. My concern is that you look at a lot of abolitionist writers and they start from the premise of things really can't get worse than they already are. And I totally understand that argument because the fact is police kill at least 3.2 people a day, 365 days a year. They get away with it. They're taking your money to brutalize you. And that's not even counting, the what I call the lesser indignities. They don't just have to kill you. They stop you without cause. They rough you up because they can. They intimidate you because they can. I understand that position. But again, going back to kind of like my conservative political views, my thought is it can always get worse. No matter how bad anything is, it can always get worse. People say it's always darkest before the dawn. I say it's always darkest before it goes pitch black, So I agree with a lot of the, I'll use, for example, your 10 demands. I read through that whole list. The end goal might be abolition, but I'm on board with pretty much everything getting up to that point. I don't think you need to abolish the police to have a dramatic change in how things operate. You still need someone to go around collecting the evidence to have it to prosecute people in court later if need be. So I'm going to hit that first. I understand the abolitionist viewpoint. I'm not there yet. On defund, 100% on board. It might be a different issue with respect to the political use of the language. When defund the police came out, there was a lot of pushback on this is terrible for Democrats. This is going to lead to more Trumpists getting elected. I understand that argument. I didn't say anything about it because back in 2014, when Black Lives Matter first came up, there was the exact same pushback from the exact same people. By saying Black Lives Matter, you're saying white lives don't, all lives matter, blah, blah, blah. And then now fast forward 6-7 years, Black Lives Matter is you say it, people know what it means, and public support for it has increased dramatically compared to 2014. So the same thing may or may not happen with defund. We don't know, but I've learned enough to know to keep my mouth shut because, it might be. And I don't want to be on record saying, oh, this is a terrible thing. And it turns out, they're absolutely correct. What you call it is separate from what you do. And with respect to what you do, that type of stuff is desperately needed. You use it as an example. New York City, they just had a shooting in Times Square just a few days ago. And Andrew Yang, who's running for mayor, was like, oh, this is proof we can't afford to defund the police. New York City has the largest per capita police budget in the entire country. They spend more money taken from the community on police hiring, training, salaries, pensions, equipment, settlements for lawsuits than anywhere else in the United States. And they still can't prevent crime because that's not their job. Cops don't prevent crime. Cops are crime janitors. They come in after a crime to sweep up evidence so that maybe if they decide to prosecute, there's a basis to do so. They don't prevent crime. Everyone wants to talk about cops preventing crime. They don't. There have been dozens of studies over the years analyzing police presence. And the fact is, the more cops you add, there's no corresponding reduction in crime. It's security theater. It makes people feel good if they think cops actually do something like that, and they don't. And again, this is something that has been studied by people who study these sorts of things for years now. This is not a new thing. Like we just don't have the data. We don't know. We have the data. The data is very clear. Even in New York City, if you look a few years back, when Bill de Blasio first got elected, the police were very pissed off and they decided to go on strike and they stopped responding. And what you saw was crime went down when police weren't busy harassing people, inventing crimes. So this is empirical fact. People can debate it if they want, but the facts are there. If you want to ignore the facts, then okay. You look, for example, at response calls, 911 calls in every jurisdiction that makes their data available. More than 90% of 911 calls are not for crimes. It's for car accidents, welfare checks, cat stuck in a tree, cops calling in themselves to notify other cops that they're going to go do something. It's just not criminal stuff. So all of this money you're spending on police, when 90% of their stuff coming through dispatch is not for police, take that money and put it towards the people that it's for. If you want to do a welfare check, send someone who's trained to do welfare checks. Now, if you want to send a cop with them to sit back and, monitor and make sure things don't go south, okay, fine. I think that's stupid, but I at least understand the argument. But sending someone specially trained for that sort of thing is better than sending someone who's not and has a gun and is trained to enforce compliance no matter what. If you're dealing with someone who's schizophrenic, I have a family member who's got schizophrenia, has to take medication. When they stop taking their meds, they don't think right. There's no rationalizing, that sort of thing. Well, when a cop shows up, their goal is enforcing compliance so they can go home at night no matter what. Well, that's not going to work to someone who's not thinking rationally and who is physically incapable of thinking rationally because of the fact they have this mental illness. If they're not medicated, they can't. There is no leading them to a path of rationality because of the wiring going on. And so the likely outcome is that one of those two people is potentially going to end up dead. And either way, someone's going to end up on the ground, arrested, likely roughed up. And we don't need that. You can have someone trained in dealing with those types of situations who can be calm and reassuring and talk to them and get them to go along willingly to get medicated or committed or whatever you need to do, versus someone showing up like a big dick commando warrior with a glock and handcuffs, trying to force someone to do what they want. So it's just, we have so many things that we have had police do more and more because the policymakers and the people that put those policymakers in office are convinced that police protect and serve. And so you can just give them more things to do, but they don't. They break things and kill people. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And having them do more of that is fantastically stupid.
Oh, what an answer. I mean, honestly, man, thank you. That's like, and for the record, guys, this guy's a conservative. Okay. So, I mean, it means to me even more to hear it coming from you, because I expect that kind of answer. And typically they're not even worded as well from people who, appear like they're more on my side, so to speak. I mean, you nailed it. And I think it's worth mentioning, the one like caveat about abolition that you said, you need them to collect evidence, right? Like, we just need someone to collect evidence.
Right.
So if that's your hang up, to me, it's really simple. Like, we get rid of police because policing itself from its founding is a white supremacist institution that has always been violent and always for profit. So find someone else who is skilled at collecting evidence. That's a forensic scientist. There are people like that who don't have guns, who can collect evidence and do a better job of it. So we put them next to the social workers when crimes are committed. And we know from having funded these communities now with jobs training, education, other social services, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, crime will go down. So in the instances there are crime, again, like you said, they're not stopping crime. Currently, they're solving only 2%. So let's get people who can actually solve the crimes that happen.
Right.
And those just wouldn't be police. So I think I've made you an abolitionist.
We'll see.
Okay. All right.
I'm still going to say I'm not there yet, because like you missed the first part.
What-
It can
what I
always
did.
get worse. It can always get worse. No matter how bad it is, it can get worse.
Right. Okay. So maybe you can explain to me more what you mean by that, because certainly, who we elect and to make new worse laws can certainly impact everybody at all levels. But if we're properly allocating these billions of dollars in each of these cities, like, how would it get worse?
Right. I mean, typically what I would say to that is, my background's in computer science. And when you write a program and you go through and test it, what you do is you start with typically the crazy edge cases, the stuff that you would never expect a person to put in. And when you look at your programs that you use, typically when you have bugs, it's because you didn't have that. So if you have, for example, a screen comes up and it says enter a password, you're expecting some form of text, whether it's, letters, numbers, symbols, whatever. Well, if you put in something crazy, exclamation point, caret, caret, comma, comma, 3, sometimes those types of things will completely upend the operating system and everything goes to hell. So apply that same concept, not to police as an entity, but to the concept of policing. If you have someone on the outliers, someone who is a full-blown sociopath who happens to like killing people, serial murderer, whatever else, start dealing with that. How do you rein that person in? Then come into people that, might not be, are fixable, if you will, through those social services and that sort of thing. How do you have people on the margins who end up missing that particular set of benefits? Because everything we do in this country is filtered through the federal government, state government, local governments, and they've got different variations of competence in terms of what's going on. Even in cities like Durham, as an example, is a very progressive city that I live in. It's very blue. It's very well funded in terms of its government. I still have clients who have, not made it to school because they're having to work, or they're having to, deal with family that can't get them to the school bus on time and won't take them to school after the fact. And we don't have solutions for that right now. It's typically, throw the parents in jail, which doesn't fix the problem. So a lot of the focus on abolition is, hey, if we do these other things, crime will go down, which is true. But you're still going to have some crime just because of the sheer variation of the people who, exist. And then also the people who aren't criminally disposed, but miss out on the services that we're trying to get them, just because of the natural incompetence that comes with anything where you're administering it through a government system. So that would be my take on it.
All right. I mean, my answer to that is that, again, policing isn't the answer. So it's still an abolitionist framework. You just have to provide as many safety nets in this as possible, do as much outside of government as possible. And also, it's not like we're saying that, as an abolitionist of, you're not just a police abolitionist, you're a prison abolitionist as well, because you're against carceral punishment. And the institutions of old, the mental health facilities of old were very carceral in nature, and that's why, and they were prison like, and that's why they were all shut down. Some of them weren't, but they were all shut down, which caused new problems we came to see. So we're not saying don't build new ones. We're just saying build new ones that are different from the old ones. And so people like this who would not be able to be treated in outpatient would be put into a place that could protect them and protect their communities without treating them like animals, or
Right.
prisoners.
Now I'm going to
So
say, I'm going to, you said something that sounded very conservative. And
really,
so I just want to, do as much outside of government as possible.
oh yeah,
That makes you a Republican practically in the
Well,
pre-Trump era,
yeah, I hear you. I was just interviewed by someone else where I was in your seat, and the first question they asked me is like, what is your political ideology and what do you think the role of government is? And I actually said, ideally there would be as little government as possible, and the communities would care for each other and themselves. What comes next, though, in my book, would be a very big government that did the right things.
Right.
The worst government is what we have now, a big government that does the wrong things.
Right.
So, and that's how, like, a true conservative in many ways is more like someone on the far left who is interested in, having the government, be a lot smaller at this top level, and at the, lower levels, the community levels, be controlled by the people themselves. Okay, moving on. Tell me about the cases you take on as a trial attorney.
God.
And say, as much as you would like, no pressure, but I'm curious about, what you mean by protecting people from the government, which I think is very important. And then defending the First Amendment, also really important. And then, the third aspect, helping aspiring entrepreneurs, that's obviously as a lefty, that's probably the least important to me. But I also understand, particularly when it comes to historically, silenced, disfranchised communities, that's critically important.
Right. So my background, I came to North Carolina in 1998 and was in college for 2 years, and I couldn't afford it and I dropped out. And I was out of college for 5 years. I was homeless for a stretch of that. Finally, in 2005, had worked myself up enough that I could afford to go back, and graduated in 2009, decided I wanted to go to law school. So when I started my practice,
let me stop you really quickly. Sorry. The period of houselessness, that was after already being a computer scientist, or?
So no, I was in the middle. So I had my freshman and sophomore years, dropped out in May of 2000. And then from May until September of that year, I didn't, we call it houseless, homeless, whatever. To me, it's all, again, I'm going back to the conservative piece. I'm unreconstructed on the language. I know houselessness is preferable.
I'm not correcting you. It's just the word I'm going to use.
Understood. But yeah, so for that span from May until September, I didn't have anywhere to stay. Well, I use that term loosely. I didn't have a place to go back to. So I made it work. I had, there was a library on campus that at the time was open 24 hours. And if you were a student, you could stay there whenever. And I still had my student ID from before I dropped out. So I would stay in the library overnight. And then during the day, I would find somewhere to sleep, towards the end of that summer, a young lady I was dating at the time would basically sneak me into her dorm. And, eventually she got into trouble, but that was how I was able to kind of keep a roof over my head and everything else.
That is whatever you want to call it. That is not, you may have made, and I think the distinguishing element here is if you made a home of this, of your partner's dorm, you had a home, but you did not have a house.
Right.
That is the truth. You were houseless at that time.
Yeah, that's fair. And it's something where I part of me always feels bad talking about it because it sucked for me. Like, it was a terrible situation, but working in Raleigh at the time, and, you go through downtown Raleigh and there are folks that don't even have that, they're camped out under the interstate because they just physically don't have anywhere to go.
And I'll just say, that is what separates people from being housed and not, or having a home and not. It is family. It is relationships. It's not because these people are all mentally ill. It's that one thing of like level of protection that some people happen to have and others don't, you know, and women with children is the largest growing segment of this population. So you know, it would be wrong to us to say today that it's still the result of the institutions closing 50 years ago or whatever.
Right. Missing that network,
yeah, exactly,
is a big part of it.
Yeah.
So when I started my law firm in 2012, finally graduated undergrad in 2009, realized I hated computer science stuff. I mean, I had my best paying job I ever had was doing tech stuff, and I hated it so much. And I'm now at a point, you know, I've been practicing law for 9 years. I still have moments where I'm like, I really should go back to the tech industry because I could make obscene bundles of money. You know, I hated it. So I decided to go to law school, finished in 2012, opened my own firm, you know, a month later, a month after passing the bar exam. And the business piece was that I wanted to help other folks make sure that they were not in my situation, where during those 5 years where I had dropped out of college, it was very hard to keep a job because all I had was a high school diploma and 2 years of college, which, you know, the only thing worth less than a college degree is part of a college degree, you know? So I worked at several spots where, you know, this was, I hate to date myself, but, you know, I started in 2000. Of course, 9/11 happened in 2001. The job I was at the time laid me off because after 9/11, the economy contracted. They ended up losing a boatload of money. So I was the last one hired, which meant I was the first one fired. And that happened several times over that 5-year span. You know, I worked at UPS loading trucks for a bit. I worked for several different law firms, which is how I got the bug to be in the legal field. I worked as a clerk of court for a year and a half, where I got fired because I had disagreed with the local Republican Party, and my boss was an elected Republican, and she thought that was a political liability. So ended up, I got fired the day after Election Day. She said, pack your shit and get out of my building. So, you know, I had this view that if I'm going to start a law practice, I wanted to make sure that I'm helping people not be in my situation, not have to drop out, not being in a situation where they can be fired for any reason, and helping them start a business was a big part of that. So that's kind of, I know you said that's the least important part. I'm going to start with that first. That was why I was trying to make sure that, you know, running my own practice, I can't be fired. The only people that can fire me are,
right?
What's that?
You changed my mind.
But yeah, running a business, you can't be fired except by your customers. And if my customers are firing me, I don't deserve to have them, you know? So protecting people from the government, that is plain Jane criminal defense. When I started, I originally billed myself as a higher education lawyer because I had served on our statewide university governing board. I had been elected to run the statewide association of student governments, and the student leader was on that board. So I knew a lot about higher education law. And I said, well, great, not many lawyers do this. I'm going to do it. And I discovered not many lawyers do it because there are no clients in it. It's very difficult to make any money. So my first like 3 higher education clients were just college students charged with crimes. You know, I had a young lady who was actually being stalked by a local police officer, had racked up 5 underage drinking tickets before she turned 21 because this particular officer wanted to sleep with her and she refused. So that was my first client, criminal defense. Second guy was growing weed in his dorm room, which is a very foolish idea because the university can come into your dorm room at any time without a warrant. That's part of the terms of having a dorm. Don't do illegal things in your dorm rooms. That was the second guy. Third one was someone pledging a Greek letter organization as part of the hazing process. They had to steal something from the local Walmart. Walmart always prosecutes every conceivable shoplifter if they can. So that was my third one. So as I'm doing my law firm stuff, I realized higher education is not getting me clients, and what I'm doing is criminal defense. So I just started calling myself a criminal defense attorney. On the First Amendment piece, that actually overlaps both areas. So on the criminal defense side, I defend a lot of protesters. You know, we have, going back to 2013, 2014, we had what we call the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina. I've defended Black Lives Matter protesters when that started here locally. We had a bill passed in 2016 called House Bill 2. It's basically a bathroom bill where we're going to create a government-funded potty patrol to check your genitals before you went into the restroom. There were protests related to that. I defended those folks. We've had protests about the funding of education, where a group of teachers walked from Durham to Raleigh and blocked traffic. I defended those people. So that's a tremendous part of it, is defending folks' abilities to protest. And then in addition, a lot of times on the business side, you have a lot of defamation lawsuits where people will sue. If I buy something from you and I don't like it, and I say that online, sometimes the person will actually file suit saying you've defamed me by saying I don't like your product. I usually will defend the defamation suits, because it's just, defamation typically is garbage anyway. And so that's also just a different piece of the First Amendment. And then when the Me Too movement happened, you saw a lot of women come forward and say, hey, I've been sexually assaulted by this guy. And then the woman ends up getting sued for telling the truth about what happened to her. So I'll give you a true story. Happened here in North Carolina. I wrote an article about it that I can send you if you want to read it. But basically, there was a nudist organization locally. And I didn't know anything about nudists. But then in addition to that, I didn't know they had very elaborate bylaws for their organization. So like, you're not allowed to touch people without consent. You're not supposed to stare, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in this particular group, the vice president of the group had a habit where he would wait until a woman was alone, would go up behind them, squeeze their breasts, slap their ass, and walk off. And he had done this repeatedly. Well, there was one particular woman who was also part of the executive leadership that he did that to, and she complained. And when she complained, they did an investigation. They found other people that he had done that to as well, and they kicked him out of the group. He filed a defamation suit because they kicked him out of the group, saying that the woman he had done it to had defamed him by saying he had done it. And then the group had defamed him by saying he was being kicked out for violating their guidelines. And then he sued two of the other people that also claimed that he had groped them. So they hired me to defend that particular case, because in a lot of states, New York is an example, Texas, California, there are special statutes that kind of end these lawsuits early. If you're filing a bogus defamation suit, it's called a SLAP, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And these states have anti-SLAP statutes where you can get the case thrown out quickly, and the losing party has to pay the winner's attorney's fees. It helps, deter the bad defamation cases. North Carolina doesn't have that. This particular case stretched on for almost a year, and it was obvious that what happened was constitutionally protected speech. Me saying you groped me, as I'm testifying under oath that you groped me, and I've got affidavits from 7 other women that you have a pattern of groping people. That's all First Amendment protected conduct, being allowed to say what happened to you. So we ended up winning, but it took a lot of time and effort in putting all of that together. So on the First Amendment side, it's defending protesters from the police, and then defending people that are using their constitutional rights from being sued by people who want to shut them up.
Wow. All really important stuff. That's for sure. And especially, I can relate to the protest stuff. In the early 2000s, I was kettled in DC and had my mask taken off. They took photos of me, and there were sharpshooters like pointing their guns from the buildings above. And obviously I know a lot of people who've been completely brutalized by police. So what has been like the success rate when it comes to that? Like, they're trying to create more and more laws against exercising your First Amendment right to protest, and increasing the power of police to disperse protesters by any means necessary. So it seems like an uphill battle.
It is. Not just with protesters, but with criminal defense in general. Pretty much all of the laws are written to benefit police. You look at the text of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that's a radically anti-police document. If you go through and look at each clause of the Bill of Rights, so First Amendment, as an example, has 5 clauses. If you break each of those down and count them up, how many are focused on limiting the government's ability to investigate, prosecute, convict, jail? More than half of the Bill of Rights are focused on restraining police power, stopping police from doing things. But then you look at the statutes that have been passed since then, and the Supreme Court decisions that have happened since then, they all go the other direction. Like the ability of prosecutors to get away with just absolutely bonkers things is mind-boggling. and applies to police as well. So dealing with protesters, it is an uphill battle, but the one benefit is that at least there's fairly robust case law from the Supreme Court and lower courts on what constitutes, a right to protest, free speech, that sort of thing. What constitutes time, place, and manner restrictions, and whether or not they're reasonable, that sort of thing. So in terms of my success rate, I've probably done close to 200-300 cases at this point. I've only had maybe 5 or 6 convictions. With the Moral Monday stuff, we had 2 people who were found guilty and decided not to appeal. We had 2 who were found guilty who appealed, and what happens when you appeal in North Carolina, you start at district court, you're convicted or not. If you're convicted, you do a brand new trial from scratch in Superior Court. So it's like the previous conviction didn't count. And then if you're convicted there, you go to the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court. So out of those 100-ish Moral Monday folks, 2 were convicted but appealed. And while it was in front of Superior Court, the DA decided they didn't want to pursue it. Haven't had any of my Black Lives Matter protesters convicted. None of the teachers were convicted. None of the HB2 people were convicted. I had one guy who was part of a group that took over the board of the university system. They just kind of came in and sat in the seats and refused to leave. I think he accepted a plea for disorderly conduct because he didn't want to deal with it. I did have one conviction about 2 weeks ago where someone said to a Confederate protester, "You only got one eye, bitch. Do something, bitch." And the prosecutor filed charges against them for disorderly conduct by use of abusive language, which is lunacy to me. And then we had a trial, and the judge was, I can't really comment on the judge, but long story short, ended in a conviction.
Yeah.
Because we did a bench trial instead of a jury. We waived our jury rights because my particular client is, a gender non-binary person of color in a particular county that is purity banjo territory with, Confederates every few steps. So we thought at the time that, waiving jury was probably the smarter move. And then the judge we were in front of just disagreed with that.
I mean,
but
yeah.
Overall, I'd say, 300-ish cases, less than 10 for sure, I have convictions. Because the law is clear. For the most part, the DAs realize that they're wasting their time, because we have a very good set of attorneys who defend these cases. It's not just me. There's probably about 6 or 7 lawyers who this is a big part of what they do. And they will take every case to trial if the DA is not willing to dismiss it on their own. And a lot of DAs realize they got other things to worry about. They've got murders and rapes and, child molestation, things that actually matter, compared to police being dicks to a bunch of people that want to use their First Amendment rights.
Yeah. And all of this just says so much about the importance of having a defender, and thus, the next step would be like the importance of having the appropriate caseloads and financing of public defenders, if they can't afford, to hire someone. And then like the luck of the draw when it comes to like who is prosecuting the case, who's the judge on the case, and then, as part of the 10 demands, getting rid of that prosecutorial discretion and immunity and judicial discretion and all of these things, along with the 3 strikes laws and everything else.
Right.
It's great news to hear about your success, that's for sure. One last thing on the First Amendment, since it has been coming up a lot recently, and you also kind of have a tech background. What is your take on big tech and censorship, and like certain accounts being removed not only from one platform, but in people's entireties of like beings not being allowed to be on social media, and like the difference between hate speech and free speech and things like that.
So this is where the conservative part of me is going to come out. I love big tech. I think big tech is great. It's especially, I used to work for Apple back before they were cool. So maybe I just have a natural bias towards that. But then also, you go through a lot of the suspensions, and I'm going to stipulate there are exceptions to every rule when I say this, but particularly on, I'll talk about the Republican side just because cancel culture has been such a thing that they bleed about. A lot of the people who get suspended absolutely fucking deserved it. You look at their tweets over the span of God knows how long, and they are routinely just complete and total shitheads towards everybody, completely violating the terms of service that you sign up for when you get there. And their bans are absolutely deserved. The president of the United States is a good example. Fuck Donald Trump. He absolutely should have been blocked from Twitter and Facebook. And I'm glad he's still gone. I don't care that he's now a private citizen, because the fact is he's congenitally incapable of following the rules of the service that he's using. So I do not care a whit about a lot of these people who have been suspended. Now, the problem comes in that it's absolutely impossible to do decent moderation at the scale that these services become. So you have to rely on algorithms. And there's no good way to write algorithms to get the job done. I had a particular post back during the election season that was a parody. I posted a link of a parody, and in my post, I made it clear that it was parody. I got suspended for that because I was sharing misinformation. Well, when I say it's a friggin' parody, that's obvious. Yes, it's intentionally misinformation because that's the whole point of a parody. It's not a real thing. And so Facebook suspended me. You look at Twitter as an example. I've been suspended from Twitter 3 separate times, not because of stuff that I thought merited suspension, but because back in 2019, there was, going back to this whole Me Too thing, there was a voice actor in Texas who had assaulted one of his coworkers and assaulted another one of his coworkers. They both came out and said, hey, he assaulted me, and he sued them for defamation. And I was asked to comment on it. And I said, he's going to lose, which he did, by the way. He lost a year later. But his fans were so incensed that an attorney would come forward and say their favorite actor was going to lose, that they found tweets that they mass flagged. And even though the tweets themselves were fine, I got suspended because of the mass flagging, because the way the algorithms are set up, if a bunch of people are reporting a particular tweet, obviously that must mean something bad. They went back to 2010 when I first joined Twitter and found a tweet that I had sent to a law school classmate about something we were talking about in the law school class, and they suspended me because it was promoting violence. Well, let's assume even if it were, bro, that was 10 years ago. Why are you suspending me for something 10 years ago? It's so stupid. So there is no good way to do the algorithms. The way they are doing them is probably worse than it potentially could be. And the total lack of humans kind of double checking to make sure that the system is not screwing up is just not there, because a lot of these folks, even though they make a ton of money, their money is not spent on quality staff. It's spent on adding more servers and expanding the marketing and hiring good lawyers to deal with, all the lawsuits and everything else. So I'm not sympathetic to the whole big tech is evil and censoring me, but at the same time, I do recognize that well-meaning people are getting caught up in the censorship. And then at that point, it can feel like you're being targeted even when you're not.
Yeah. And then, I'm not a free speech absolutist. And, I think my beliefs can confuse people too. I mean, as an abolitionist, I also don't believe the common phrase I stuck to for the majority of my life, until really understanding what abolition meant and changing my mindset. The only good Nazi is a dead Nazi. I believe that all people can be reformed and transformed, and that, the many people are Nazis, so to speak, and saying disgusting things on social media because of generations of disinformation and brainwashing. So they're victims themselves as well. And, but I also, but I do think that, like, if you're attacking people and you're posting horrible racist, like, or, centuries old anti-Semitic tropes, like, you should not be here. And then you have this, like, looming big brother scenario, like, with increasing surveillance in our country. And like, if you look at, for instance, recently things came out about you know, how there are private companies that are surveilling the family members of people who are incarcerated, not
Yep.
just the people who are incarcerated, but tracking everything that everyone they know is doing. So when you put all of that together, it's very scary. So when people are removed for things that they say, it creates this feeling of like we're getting closer and closer to 1984.
Right. Note though, you look at, for example, Clearview AI with the face recognition algorithms, the departments in California that were tracking the family members of people that have been arrested. A lot of that goes back to the government orchestrating it. They're hiring contractors, private companies to do it, but it's with the government's blessing. And if you can, you know, to me, I wouldn't call myself a free speech absolutist, but I'm pretty damn close. And I say that because the First Amendment limits the government. That's it. It doesn't limit a lick of private companies at all. They can do what they want. And I'm also a big fan of social consequences. If I call you, you know, the N-word, for example, and you punch me in the mouth, well, I kind of had that coming. So from that standpoint, a lot of these companies that are engaged in this kind of extrajudicial stuff should absolutely be put out of business. And they would be if legislators would say, we're not going to do this. You know, the government, if the government did it directly, would not be allowed to do this. We're not going to create an exception to allow a company to do this on our behalf, because then you're just trying to do an end run around the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is screwed up in itself.
Yeah.
But a lot of it comes down to you got to have better politicians, because both the Democrats and the Republicans love the control that comes with over policing and trying to have the government do what they want to their enemies.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And we've hit an hour. I know you're a busy guy, so that's a perfect way to lead to my last question. You know, I think that, you know, we have this two-party system. It's a stranglehold. The alternatives have always, unfortunately, proven to be problematic. There's been, you know, and I'll be honest, I don't even know what the alternatives are on the right, but I can say that, you know, the Green Party, there's been corruption. Movement for the People's Party, which is the newer version, there's been a variety of problems with lack of accountability, lack of transparency, racism, and then there's this like huge swath of people on the left who, if I support someone who's running as a Democrat, a down ballot progressive who is like an abolitionist, they're, no matter what, if they have a D next to their name, they're running under that party. And I get why, because we've seen what's happened to the so-called squads since they've gotten in office. They're like, not voting for them. They're terrible. They're a Democrat. I know what's going to happen. Yet it seems like you can't really get elected if you're not a Democrat or a Republican. So first off, who did you vote for this last presidential election? I think I know the answer. What are your thoughts on this guy's first however many days, 100+ days? And what are your thoughts on down ballot elections, which to me, I think are most critical,
Right.
and what we can do about the so-called stranglehold of the two-party system?
There's a lot in those questions. So let's start with the presidential election stuff. I supported Elizabeth Warren in the primary. I did not agree with a lot of her politics, but one, I respected the fact that she's smart and actually gave them some thought. You know, a lot of politicians, and I say this as someone who was involved in politics for years. I used to be a vice chairman of the Wake County Republican Party. I ran for office in 2016 as a Republican. A lot of people in elected office are utter morons. They get elected because they're very good people. They're good at schmoozing. They're good at convincing folks that you know, they care about you and that sort of thing. But when you start talking to them about policy, they're dumb as bricks. They want to know what everyone else in their caucus is doing. You know, there are exceptions, of course, to everything. But Elizabeth Warren seemed like she actually understood the policy part, which to me mattered a lot in a president, especially after 4 years of Donald Trump. After she lost
quickly, did it impress you that she was once a Republican and became a Democrat, in that like she put enough thought into what it meant to like change, or did that not matter? Or I'm
going to be totally honest with you. I didn't know that until way after the fact. Like came to Raleigh for a rally that I went to before I had made up who I was going to support. And she mentioned that as part of her story. And I was like, oh, that was cool. No, for me, what got me was that on her website, there was a bunch of bona fide policy papers, because a lot of campaign websites, that's totally absent. It's like 3 bullet points of, ephemera.
Yep.
Whereas in her case, it was, we're going to do this. And oh, by the way, here's this long detailed policy paper on how to make it happen. And you never do that in politics, because there's a line in Hamilton, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm not going to say it verbatim, but essentially Aaron Burr is telling Hamilton, the more you say, you provide more ammunition to your enemies.
Yeah.
And that is exactly how politicians run. They don't commit to anything because it creates more attack ads against them. So for her to just throw caution to the wind and have as your campaign slogan, she's got a plan for that. And then you read the plan and it's an actual plan and not just bullet points on a website. I thought that was great. Even if I disagreed with big chunks of her stuff, I don't care, because I wanted someone intelligent who understood what was going on. After she lost, I ended up voting for Joe Biden. So I voted with Warren in the primaries, voted for Biden in the general. No chance in hell was I ever going to vote for Donald Trump. Just never going to happen. I didn't vote for him in 2016 either. I'm a hashtag never Trump conservative, and I took that seriously because God, he was awful. In terms of Biden has done better than I expected, honestly, but it's hard for me to evaluate his performance because it really is just the ratcheting down of the temperature and the lunacy and all the shit that we dealt with every day under Trump for 4 years. To just not have that feels good. So I don't know how much of that is Biden affirmative action as president versus Biden not being Trump as president, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In terms of trying to break the two-party system, I genuinely, again, going back to me being cynical by nature, I don't think it's going to happen. I think the only way you would get that would be a few different changes. One, you'd have to change the first past the post, winner take all election system. You'd have to have some kind of proportional voting. So, the challenge with doing that, of course, is that in America, having things like multi-member districts where you could have proportional winners, was used to enforce white supremacy, to enforce white politicians. If you had separate districts, one in a white neighborhood, one in a black neighborhood, you'd risk having a white legislator and a black legislator. So what politicians did was they create just one general district that elected 2 people. So that way the white majority could get both of those offices. It was a tremendously problematic thing in North Carolina, all throughout the South. And trying to figure out how to do proportional representation without having multi-member districts, it would be incredibly problematic. So that's part one. You have to figure out how to fix first past the post stuff. The second thing is you'd want to have some type of instant runoff voting system similar to what they've got in, is it New Hampshire? I think one of the New England states has tried it. And the reason why instant runoff voting, single transferable vote, these different forms of voting, why that matters is that it changes the incentives for the politicians who are running for office. So now, when first past the post exists, it's on you to be as just nasty and vitriolic as possible, because all you need is 1 vote more than everyone else. In the instant runoff voting context, that changes, because as you have the first set of votes come in, the people who didn't win get eliminated from the tabulation, and their votes get reallocated to whoever you picked as your second choice. Well, in that scenario, being nasty to everyone else ends up hurting you, because you're not getting those second choice votes. If you don't get a majority on the first set of ballots, well, you're not going to get it on later ballots either. So it changes the incentive. It encourages politicians to be more collegial towards one another, to not be as nasty all the time, to actually have substantive policy debates. Because I'm not just trying to get your first choice vote, I'm trying to get the second choice vote of everyone who's voting for someone else. So if you could get a point where you're making those changes, you're changing the vote allocation in terms of who gets into office, and you're changing the voting process to something like instant runoff voting, then at that point, it gets viable to have third parties, more often able to get into power, able to build their coalitions. You had said earlier, you don't know what options there are on the right. there's just right and righter. So like the Constitution Party is even more racist than the Republican Party, if you think that's possible. The Libertarian Party is even more crazy, than the Republican Party in a lot of ways, if you think that's possible. We have no good options. My hope is that given how bad Trump was, there might be a movement to kind of go back to a more normal old school Republican Party. But even then, if you look at the polls, among self-identified Republicans, more than 80-90% still approve of Donald Trump, still want him to run for office. Yeah. It's just, I'm again going back to being cynical. It can always get worse. I think we're in this spot where, as far as the GOP goes, it's only going to get worse, and there's not going to be enough of them to create a new party. And so I'm unaffiliated. I can vote in either primary, but I don't have a party banner at all. I don't know when that's going to change. Yeah. And a lot of my future is riding on Democrats not being incompetent. I've spent 30 something years of my life complaining about Democratic incompetence. And now I'm like, I'm wedded to them. I need them to not screw up, because otherwise the option is a bunch of fascists with R's by their name who tried to overthrow the government just 5 months ago. So it's tough.
Awesome. Thank you so much, man. That was a great last response. Very informative. There were some things I hadn't even thought of before. And overall, this was great. I really appreciate your time. I think I'm glad to say I had a conservative on my show. I still agree with you 99% of the time, which is, I think, really important for my listeners and the crazy left to understand that, labels aren't really important. And like you've said about the politicians, it's policies and beliefs. And whatever you call yourself, you're definitely on the right side. So
I appreciate it, man. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
All right, cool. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.